If you're a fan of ancient Egypt, you're probably familiar with their religious storytelling, the tale of Usir and Ise, or Horus and Sutek, or perhaps you know the tale of Sinuhe and the shipwrecked sailor. You might not know their historical fiction. During the New Kingdom, between 1550 and 1000 BCE, ancient Egyptian scribes would produce stories based on the exploits of famous kings and military leaders. This included such tales as the Great War between Seqenenra and Apep, or the exploits of the general Djehuty, Thutmose III conquering Canaan and Syria, Ramesses II in the Battle of Kadesh, Merneptah going into Canaan and Libya, or Ramesses III defeating the Sea Peoples. Tales like these have been the subject of numerous scholarly studies. In particular, the work of today's guest. Dr. Colleen Darnell is an Egyptologist who specializes in New Kingdom literature. She has published works on the Great Victory inscriptions of Merneptah and the Egyptian funerary books like the Book of Gates. And in 2013, she published a book on New Kingdom historical fiction, which looked at the genre of tales that told of the exploits of great kings and military commanders. Dr. Darnell sat down for this interview with the History of Egypt podcast. I share it with you so that you can enjoy. Thanks for watching. Good morning, Colleen Darnell. Welcome to the History of Egypt podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderfully, and I'm so happy to be here.
And you've just come back from an excavation or project season in Egypt. So what were you working on at the moment?
In May and much of June, I was working with my husband, Professor John Darnell, director of the El Kab Desert Survey Project. And this project has been going on for a decade now. And we've been tracing ancient desert roads going into the eastern desert around the ancient city of El Kab, and then recording the rock inscriptions, graffiti, as well as archaeological remains along the roads. And it's been really spectacular because there's an area that had essentially not been surveyed and not been mapped. And we've just found hundreds of rock inscriptions and dozens of sites.
As somebody who wanders around in the desert fairly regularly, is there a particular deity of the desert who you're quite fond of in the record?
The goddess Hathor is definitely the goddess to whom people appeal the most in a general desert context. So we think about Sad a lot because he's certainly present and very significant in the oases. But it's Hathor, and I find that so interesting because of how it ties in to the theology of the goddess of the eye, the sun, and the idea of being in the desert and the goddess coming in and greeting her at the beginning of the new year. And the main road going from El Kab through the Wadi Halal, there are several temples to the goddess Hathor, and to see how that all fits together, both in monumental formal architecture as well as in the rock inscriptions and personal records of worship, I find that particularly amazing because we can essentially stand where these ancient people stood and think about the sort of festival performances that would have occurred on an annual basis.
Excellent. And so I've brought you here today to discuss one of your recent publications. Well, we say recent, it's probably about 10 years old now, actually. Gosh, time flies. But you about a decade ago, you published a book on New Kingdom historical fiction, as you defined it. To the casual audience, this might be something they've never really heard about with context of ancient Egypt. You know, we have modern historical fiction about it, but the idea that the ancient Egyptians are writing their own historical fiction about their history might not be so familiar to people. So very briefly, what is New Kingdom historical fiction? What are the major texts and when are they being written?
Through my study, I was able to identify 4 ancient works of historical fiction. They all date to the Ramessid period. So between the reigns of Ramses II and Ramses III seems to be the date of the extant copies of the papyri. And obviously, that's always a good question of, are there earlier versions of these texts that could have been written? But what we have are the quarrels of Apepi and Seqenenra, so set in the Second Intermediate period, but the papyrus is dated to the reign of Merneptah. We have 2 stories Again, 19th dynasty in date, set during the reign of Thutmose III, and then a story set to the reign of Ramses III that might have been composed about the time of his reign, maybe a little bit later. So it could have been fictionalized even by the end of his reign about his Libyan campaigns.
Mm.
And the definition of historical fiction that I use is essentially the same as for modern historical fiction, that it is an invention of certain events and characters, but set within a historical framework so that there's either a real event that happens or real characters that are present in the historical record. And then a fictional story is woven around those elements. And because the ancient Egyptians were so great at record keeping, there was so much investment in maintaining libraries, maintaining records, both in the monumental presentation, but especially on papyri, thinking here of the Turin King's List, that they're using their knowledge of their own history to then weave entertaining fictional tales. And I find it remarkable that the ancient Egyptians composed their own historical fiction and to find that sense of enjoyment in that genre over thousands of years.
And so, as you mentioned, the surviving papyri that record these texts tend to be middle to late 19th dynasty, approximately. But of course, ancient Egyptian rulers and military leaders have been going on expeditions, getting into all kinds of adventures for centuries before these tales are being written down in the form that survives. For the audience, some of the earliest examples of the sort of adventure tale are the biographies of people like Harkuf and Weni from the Old Kingdom, going out into foreign lands, coming back, telling people what they've experienced, or Ankh Tifi of Mawala, with his kind of pseudo-royal biography of campaigns and economic activity during the first intermediate period. Today, we might commonly think of these adventures as being primarily a New Kingdom phenomenon, simply because the record is so much better preserved there. But to your understanding of the historical record, when do you think this type of story, this kind of biographical adventure tale with military elements or that kind of material, when did they begin to emerge? Do you think it's Old Kingdom, First Intermediate period, or older? What are your thoughts?
That's such a fascinating way of thinking about the literary history of Egypt. And because of the limitations of the extant sources, I wouldn't want to make a guess saying, okay, historical fiction is going to be present in the first intermediate period or going to be present in the Middle Kingdom. But the way I think about it is that there are three genres that do go back to the Old Kingdom into the Middle Kingdom that really are necessary for then the creation of historical fiction. And where we see that come together is the New Kingdom. And there could be many 18th dynasty compositions, for example, Astarte and the Sea, dated to the reign of Amenhotep II, where one papyrus completely changes our understanding of the literary record because each of the four works of historical fiction are only attested in a single papyrus. So one gets destroyed and suddenly you're missing that entire tale. So among those three genres that I think are essential, the first are those autobiographical texts that you mentioned, carved on tombs in tomb chapels and that record significant events during a person's lifetime. And sometimes those do focus on either military events, such as Weni's leading of a military campaign multiple times, and that beautiful poetic passage of returning from the land of the sand dwellers. And then you also have adventure and exploration, such as the autobiography of Harhuf. At the same time, you have actual expeditionary records in rock inscriptions that an expedition leader or through a scribe is leaving at the site. And grammatically, those will often use what we call narrative infinitives. So these very basic forms of going out to the desert region by, and then whoever the person or the group may be. And those expeditionary accounts that seem to be a day-to-day record on papyrus, we can guess, as well as then presented in a more formal way in rock inscriptions, those then inform and are adapted by the day books into, for example, the annals of Thutmose III, those beautiful records of the Battle of Megiddo and the almost 24 additional campaigns during his reign. So he's drawing both from this standard genre of presenting events in one's reign, which really gets started for kings at the end of the First Intermediate Period. Antef II and Houndstila, I'm thinking of here, and Montuhotep II at the dawn of the Middle Kingdom. And it's interesting, likely because of the conservative nature of the institution of kingship, that we first see these presentations of autobiographical events in the non-royal sphere. And then particularly because of the regional aspects of the Theban dynasty, then adopting something that nomarchs of their family had probably been doing for quite some time, and then using that for royal texts. And then that continues. And then, of course, the third element that we need is fictional literature. And I find it especially fascinating how some of the stories of the Middle Kingdom, the shipwrecked sailor, for example, the story of Sinuhe, involve travel, involve adventures to foreign lands. And so everything is really set up, everything is there to then innovate and create a genre of historical fiction. But it could already exist in the Middle Kingdom, and we're simply missing those stories. But I would be pretty confident to say that by the time of the 18th dynasty, I think such texts are probably being composed. But if we want to be the most conservative, we can say the first time it's actually attested in the papyri.
Sure. As always, with the asterisk that tomorrow somebody might uncover something that completely resets the record as we've described it. Two questions that arise from those answers. First one is kind of informal, describing all these texts, Hakuf, Weni, the rock inscriptions. Do you have any plans to look at this as these all as a kind of holistic corpus, and publish a book looking at kind of desert adventure tales of ancient Egypt? Are there any thoughts on that kind of work?
Actually, there is a book that's just coming out. I don't know if it's formally published yet or not, by Vincent Morel, that describes this interaction of expeditionary and literary texts, focusing particularly on the Wadi Hammamat. And that also relates to some of the work that John published in the Theban Desert Road Survey, Volume 1, where you have a inscription of a priest, and then someone actually copied out in response part of the story of Sinuhe, the letter from the story of Sinuhe. And it's incredible to think someone had memorized that or had a papyrus copy and was carving this literature out in the desert. So a lot of that material has been published and is coming out, although I'd always love to write more about the literary aspects of military texts, going all the way back to my 2003 book, The Great Karnak Inscription of Berneptah. That's been one of my primary interests as a scholar.
Well, that's kind of what I was getting at with the question, is kind of like a historical fiction, imagining the past, part 2, like looking at these things from that lens. Any plans to do that kind of book?
That would be interesting. My publication schedule is a little packed at the moment. That's one thing with archaeological work, is you record so much data and then the amount of time that it takes to process it. But I do plan in the future to return to literary aspects of historical text, because I think that's a wonderful way of planning out a part 2, is the fiction side of the military, but then looking more at the literary side of actual military text as opposed to the military aspects of the fictional text. But there's so much secondary literature to go through for that topic as well.
Fair enough. And the other sort of subsidiary question I had, thinking about people like Hakuf, Weni, Angtifi of Mawala, or more recently for the New Kingdom, somebody like Mosa, son of Ibana, or Amenemhab, who joins Thutmose III on his campaigns. For these individuals, we have these wonderful inscriptions that adorn their tombs, either within the in the chapel, or even in the case of Harkuf, on the exterior wall, looking out over the river. One thing that I often try to stress for people who are not as familiar with ancient Egypt is that while we call these structures tombs, they are to some degree more like private chapels with a burial space inside, preferably secluded or concealed. So people are supposed to visit them. They're supposed to visit Harkuf or Weni or Ankh-Tifi, and they're supposed to visit Ahmose Bana and read or see what they have done in their life. Keeping that context in mind, how do you imagine the recitation or performance of these texts? Do you think they're aimed solely at somebody who comes to the tomb and can read them as a biography? Or do you think they might have hoped that people would read or even sing them to an audience gathering at the tomb? How do you imagine the transmission?
I imagine this like the banqueting and festival scenes that we see depicted within the tomb chapels. And I agree, it is so significant to emphasize that when you are visiting an ancient Egyptian tomb, the decorated upper portion of the chapel, you are actually fulfilling the ancient Egyptians' intention for creating that space and decorating it. And although I don't think there's any direct textual evidence of this, I could see an aspect of the reading aloud or even the performance of different aspects of an autobiographical text or an inscription describing, say, Ahmose son of Abana and his spectacular military exploits, that this being a particularly appropriate time to celebrate those accomplishments during, in Thebes, the beautiful festival of the valley, or other local equivalents to that in El Kamb, and essentially telling the story to the family, much like a veteran of World War II or another war would pass on those stories to his children. I think I like to see that aspect of it. We don't have a text, unfortunately, that says, and now this inscription is going to be read to my grandchildren. But Ahmose, son of Abana, gets as close as possible when he says, I'm speaking to you so that you might know what I have done. And I like to put that together with the obelisk inscription of Hatshepsut, where she very specifically addresses generations after generations. And so not only are the ancient Egyptians, when they carve these texts and put them in their tombs, tomb chapels, intending for their direct descendants to read them, but I think because of the tremendous length of ancient Egyptian history and the fact that they're aware of the amount of time of that history, that they do think about people thousands of years from now. And the historical fiction then from the New Kingdom is such a great way of seeing the ancient Egyptian appreciation for the past, much like the visitors' inscriptions in the step pyramid complex of Djoser, this idea of actually visiting something as a tourist. And I could see that being part of the intention for the tomb chapels and the types of texts that we're discussing.
Excellent. Okay. So let's move now to the royal stories, which are the four subjects, four tales that you focus on in the book, which again is Apep and Seqenenra, the capture of Japa, Thutmose III in Asia or in the East, and then the Libyan Wars of Ramesses III.
Mm-hmm.
All four of these texts belong to a genre that scholars tend to call the Königsnovelle, the royal story, like the romance of the king, if you will. You study it more as a historical fiction rather than in that specific perspective, but at a very basic level, this is a massive question, but what are the primary tropes of the royal novel as a genre? What are the key markers of this is that kind of tale?
Among the four tales, I wanted to start with the one that interacts with the genre of the quote royal novel is the Quarrels of Apepi and Seqenenra. There really isn't enough of Thutmose III in Asia to see if there's a connection with that genre. And the capture of Japa is very interesting because Djehuty is the main character, and it's his actions rather than the king. But in the Quarrels of Apepi and Seqenenra, we very clearly see this connection with the royal novel. And that term is a bit infelicitous because it's really not a novel in the way we think of it. And the best way to there's a number of different features one can point out. So, for example, it has to have a public setting here following Carl Janssen Winkel. It has to have an element of royal propaganda, which obviously is quite a broad criterion. It has to have a narrative structure, and the king has to be as the hero of the tale, which then would rule out capture of Japa, for example. In the Quarrels of Apepi and Seqenenra, where I connected it most to the royal novel was in its plot elements. So, for example, these texts, whether they're talking about something military or a building of a religious structure, such as Hatshepsut and the Speos or Artemidos, there's what Donald Redford calls a time of troubles, topos. So there is an absolute catastrophe. The temples are falling down, an enemy has invaded, or for Seqenenra in the fictional tale, you have a dual catastrophe of foreigners, the Hyksos dynasty and King Apepi, are ruling the northern part of Egypt so that you don't have one king ruling Upper and Lower Egypt. This is anathema to Egyptian political theology. And the beginning of the tale describes a pestilence, a time of woe, possibly disease, although they're not being specific about a pandemic that might be going on at the beginning of the story. We also see this in the Merneptah Karnak inscription, for example, where pyramids are being threatened and there's all kinds of negative occurrences. So that's the setting. And then the next event often in the royal novel is the king being enthroned in his palace, ready to address his counselors. So the king receives a message and then discusses it with scribes or generals or other members of the administration. They come up with the solution. And as we know from particularly the Thutmose III examples, are some of my favorites with the Battle of Megiddo, is they want to take the more conservative approach to Megiddo, and instead Thutmose III and other kings do this. They present a bold, entirely different plan. And so that's the typical set of plot elements that are based in historical texts on actual historical events, but very clearly framed to create this narrative structure. In the Quarrels of Apepi and Seqenenra, you see subversions of that genre, and it's hard to tell how much they're subverting the genre because we don't have the end of the story. But for example, we have Apepi in his palace at Avaris, and he's consulting knowledgeable scribes. But it's a question of to what extent the scribes are doing the composing as opposed to Apepi, which might show him as not quite the effective king. And then when the messenger gets to Seqenenra and gives the message from Apepi, which is expel the hippopotami because they keep me awake at night, Seqenenra has no idea how to respond. It actually says that he's silent for a long time. Even when he tells the content of the message to his counselors, they too are silent. Not expected for the royal novel genre. But in order to understand what's being said about Apepi and Seqenenra in a really in-depth manner, the ancient scribe or the ancient audience, so the author for certain, the audience, we would think to a certain extent, would have needed to know those other texts. And this is where I get into the literary theory of intertextuality, that if we're going to understand the actions of Apepi and Seqenenra, we have to read and understand the same text that the ancient author does to then see how he uses that genre for those fictional elements.
Okay. Speaking on that note of the date, as you mentioned, the surviving copy of Apep and Seqenenra dates to the late 19th dynasty, approximately. That is roughly 300 plus years after the events it is describing. It would be the equivalent of a modern author writing a war story in the reign of Louis XIV, perhaps. How much material do you suspect an ancient Egyptian scribe would actually be able to reference from something that far back in their history? It's not 1,000 years, but it's still a substantial chunk of time And these are events that might have been carved on a stela or recorded in some monumental fashion, but we have no proof of that. How likely might a scribe actually be able to sit down and think, here's what I know about the late 17th dynasty? How likely is it that a scribe of the late 19th dynasty could accurately describe a story of the 17th?
I think it's very likely. And the specific piece of evidence that I would use to sort of support that supposition is the stela of Kamosa. The fact that the second stela of Kamosa exists as a hieroglyphic record, what an amazing discovery of the 20th century, and Libby Pabaji's publication. But then the fact that on a writing board discovered by Howard Carter, financed by Lord Carnarvon, of the Carnarvon tablet, which actually has a hieratic copy, student's copy, scribe study copy, we don't exactly know, of the missing first stela of Kamosa. And if 3,000 years later, we can discover a hieroglyphic record and a plastered wood board with an additional hieratic text, I think it's very likely then that there would have been dozens of papyri relating to the history, the king's list, the events of the late 17th dynasty that a Ramessid scribe could have consulted. I mean, even the fact that the mathematical papyrus has certain events of Ahmosa's conquest of the Hyksos. I mean, actually, one of the mathematical papyri has little jottings of certain events at the very end of the 17th dynasty. So the fact that so much survives even until today, I think we have to suppose that there is a substantial library of historical records that the ancient Egyptians would have been able to access.
Excellent. Now I'll ask you about a story that may or may not have a accurate historical inspiration, which is the capture of Japa. So this tale is quite famous for its Trojan horse style deception tactic, or maybe we should more accurately say that Troy is famous for its Japa style deception tactic. The general Djehuty pretends to be giving up the siege of Japa on the Levantine coastal region. He presents a gift for the local ruler, a gift of submission or a gift of, hey, you fought well, here we go. But within these large wicker baskets, supposedly holding the treasure, there are Egyptian soldiers. The Japites. Japites? What do you call them? Japians? Japites?
Citizens of Japa.
Citizens of Japa. The people of Japa bring the baskets in, the Egyptian soldiers leap out. Difficulties ensue. Does this trope, first of all, this trope of attacking by hiding within an object, does this appear in any other ancient Near Eastern literature of the time or of subsequent Bronze and Iron Age stories, or is it specific to Japa and then to Troy?
The only two that I was able to find, and over the course of the last 12 years, potentially new ones have been discovered. But really, the Trojan horse is the only similar tale from the ancient Near East. The other closest parallel is actually in an 11th century CE Persian epic of the Shahnameh. And it describes, again, a city being besieged, and the general isn't able to secure the city. He isn't able to capture the city, and so he actually sees it as being less than chivalrous, less than honorable to use a stratagem, but it's the only option he has. And it's very similar, where he has soldiers go into large chests and then pretends to be a rich merchant bringing in his caravan of goods, and then the soldiers leap out. You will often see in association with the capture of Japa not only the Trojan horse, but the story from 1001 Arabian Nights of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. But that's not a good parallel at all, despite the fact that it gets mentioned a lot, because there's nothing military. It's, again, thieves and a merchant. And when the thieves hide in the large ceramic vessels, they get boiling oil poured over them. So it doesn't succeed at all. But it's interesting that that's the example that often gets mentioned in descriptions of the capture of Japa. But I think the Trojan horse is really the outstanding similarity. But I wouldn't say that there's any direct connection between them because such a stratagem is entirely possible as an independent development.
Sure. Fair enough. And one thing we should note is that the subject of this tale, the general Djehuty, was a real person, and parts of his tomb or his burial have been discovered in the Saqqara region, although I believe the actual tomb itself is currently lost again. We only have a few pieces of the burial.
Correct. So
Right.
the tomb was probably found by whoever then sold off some of the pieces in the 1840s, but the tomb has not been rediscovered. And when that happens, if there's an autobiographical text in that tomb, that is going to be truly an exciting moment. But there's a beautiful golden bowl in the Louvre as well as a scarab and the titles and canopic jars. And so those titles allow a tie-in to the Djehuty of the capture of Japa, exactly as you mentioned.
And a question of pure speculation. In your understanding, because you and Professor John Darnell did publish the book Tutankhamun's Armies, in which you looked at the military organization, the technology of the 18th dynasty period in which the capture of Joppa allegedly takes place. How realistic do you think the tactic is? Do you think it's conceivable that they could have delivered large enough baskets to conceal soldiers and pulled something like that off?
I include a figure in the book, which is a drawing of a scene from the tomb of Paheri at El Kab, early 18th dynasty, that actually does show baskets large enough to carry soldiers. And they describe not only the baskets, but also the carrying poles. And an interesting contrast with the Trojan horse story is that when the Egyptian soldiers leap out of baskets, they don't have weapons and kill everyone in the city. They actually have ropes and manacles. And the point is to take people captive and then ship them back to the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. So that part is different. So could it have succeeded? It's certainly physically possible, but no evidence that the stratagem was actually used. Now, an Egyptian general besieging a city on behalf of the king, where the king is not present at a campaign, that is certainly could be based on a historical event. We even have at the beginning of the Annals of Thutmose III that all the other campaigns with their commanders were recorded in additional records. Also, that would have been able to be accessed in the temple libraries or in other libraries. So I think Djehuty's exploits, the actual historical events, again, were probably the basis for the authors of the historical fiction, for the author of the capture of Joppa, with then a bit of imagination thrown in. And they would have also known about the siege, the 7-month siege of Megiddo, following the fact that the Egyptian army stopped to plunder because they were so phenomenally successful in surprising the ruler of Kadesh and all of his allies outside of Megiddo. And so that would have been known as well. So if we put all these pieces together, the history, I think, lines up. But people hiding in baskets, we can't say for sure. But
Yeah.
it would be great if that really happened.
Here's hoping we get that autobiographical text. You mentioned the ruler of Kadesh and also Megiddo, which brings me to the next subject, which is you discuss a story called Thutmose III in Asia, which is based on the famous, I was going to say legendary, but they're very much not legendary, the famous campaigns of Thutmose III throughout this region, repeated expeditions, stomping around Canaan, Syria, subjugating, forcing people to pay tribute, killing where he needs to, destroying, etc. But I want to discuss this tale from a slightly different perspective, which is that intertextuality you mentioned earlier. Because within the book, one of the key things you highlight is how the story of Thutmose III in Asia kind of copies directly from another famous tale, which is the Battle of Kadesh. Within this tale, you include a section where Thutmose III gives a speech in the midst of one of his campaigns. And I'm going to read the speech out loud for the benefit of the audience. So Thutmose III in this tale says, "I found my heart courageous, my heart in joy, all that I had done having succeeded. I was like Montu, the war god, while their chariot spans became like Sutek, great of strength, Baal in his moment. I was shooting my arrows on the right and capturing on the left. And you highlight this because this is basically a copy of part of Ramesses' speech from the Battle of Kadesh in the, I believe it's the poem of Pentawere, the poetic version rather than the bulletin, where Ramesses says, I found my heart courageous, my heart in joy. All that I did succeeded. I was like Montu. I shot on my right and made captures on my left. I was like Sutek in his moment in their sight. The reason I give this lengthy preamble is part to set the context, but also because it's an interesting example of how an author of a later generation is telling a tale about a very famous king, but he's cribbing, if you will, from another famous king to tell this story. And the reason I thought this was interesting is because we have such abundant and well-documented records of Thutmose III for his campaigns, his grand annals that he left at Karnak, and which presumably were copied on, writing boards or papyri by scribes doing their training. Why would an author who is writing about Thutmose, famous conqueror, take a speech from Ramesses II and give it to this earlier ruler? What is going on in this text? What is the effect of this?
I believe the intent of the author is to directly link the military successes and victories of Ramses II with his illustrious predecessor, Thutmose III. And what this most reminds me of in a more modern context, not necessarily that modern, is the fact that Julius Caesar and Napoleon both wanted to become the Alexander the Great of their time. And if there were to be a historical fiction story about Julius Caesar or about Alexander the Great, but say written during the reign of Julius, or lifetime of Julius Caesar, to then have a speech of Julius Caesar in the mouth of Alexander would be absolutely perfect. So I think it is this idea of linking famous figures over time and wanting to cast Ramses II in the best possible light. I mean, he truly is, in a way, the hero of the tale because I think the educated scribes who wrote, and probably several people, because again, if Pentawere has his copy of the Kadesh battle poem, other people certainly did, and they could have even owned both papyri. And the idea that you could compare those two and then think about how great Thutmose III is and how great Ramses II is, I think a lot of it is for these royal positive aspects of self-presentation, and obviously the word propaganda can also fit in there in terms of the identifications with as we still say today, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. And so there would be that desire to form historical connections.
Okay. The example that comes to mind when you are describing that is how sometimes today, with politicians who are finding themselves in a position where they need to choose acquiescence or defiance to a crisis. If they choose defiance, journalists or commentators or historians will often describe it as their fight them on the beaches moment, directly drawing from a more famous or a somewhat legendary politician of previous generations who was in similar circumstances, and they will directly copy the language to hammer home the idea they're trying to get across. It seemed to happen a lot, obviously, in the UK, where I've recently moved. It happened a lot with Boris Johnson, of all people, because he very consciously modeled himself as much as he could on Churchill, and the media that was sympathetic to him latched onto that and were very happy to use those motifs. Ultimately, it crumbled, but they tried. So that's kind of the example that comes to mind, is that in these tales, Thutmose III in Asia, which then directly quotes from Ramesses II, the scribes who are telling these tales, you've suggested that they might be sharing notes, or they might be reading them aloud to one another and kind of enjoying the play that they're doing. Oh, I recognize what you're doing there. You're copying Ramesses II. Again, kind of going back to that performance question I had earlier about biographies, do you think of these stories being read aloud and performed in public contexts?
Because of the limited literacy in ancient Egypt, I think it's certainly possible to suggest the stories being read aloud. I think that is a very enticing proposal. And although we don't have a text saying, and then the scribe read aloud the story of Sinuhe or the eloquent peasant for everyone's enjoyment, there is direct speech, obviously, in these texts. Not only could a narrator have told the text and played the different roles, but for all we know, there could have been some sort of dramatic reenactment where you have the king come on and make a particular speech. And maybe there was even a visual combination of something to do with Thutmose III and Ramses II. That's all entirely speculative, but I certainly would not rule it out. And I think it's also important to emphasize that the episode with the roaring hippopotami in the Quarrel of Apepi and Seqenenra, the fact that the ruler of Japa asked to see the Awenat staff, and then Djehuty says, "Sure, I'll show you the Awenat staff," and smites him over the head in a true Three Stooges like moment. Less humor in Thutmose III in Asia and the Libyan battle story. But I think there are enough entertaining elements that even someone who wasn't necessarily aware of the history, it could be fun to hear the story. Just like historical fiction today, the more knowledge you have, the more you're going to enjoy it. But if you don't have that historical knowledge, it can still be a fun read. And then the scribes who did know the history, who were in on the composition and the world of elite military scribes or someone close to the royal court, they would enjoy the tale on another level. So I don't see the audience for these stories being restricted only to a certain profession or a certain class. And the way to expand the audience would exactly be performance or reading the text aloud.
That's interesting because it seems like in scholarship we do tend to stress the elite context of their composition and their writing, but there doesn't seem to have been as much attention, perhaps because of the lack of evidence, for the performance and what that could possibly do for disseminating the tale outside of that context.
I completely agree. I tend in these sorts of interpretations of literature to err on the side of a wider audience, but that's certainly debatable. I mean, it's hard to draw that line. But with Middle Kingdom literature, where it might be a little bit more obvious, of the shipwrecked sailor would be something that everyone would enjoy. But if you were an expedition leader, if you had traveled in the Red Sea, if you had gone to Nubia, if you were someone who had completed that expedition to Nubia and knew the challenges, you would appreciate the shipwrecked sailor on a completely different level than, say, an 8-year-old who really likes the talking serpent. Again, this is taking modern perceptions and imagining what it might have been. But I think it's important to at least try out, at least consider a more expansive view of the audience of historical fiction in the New Kingdom.
And on that note, we'll bring the questions about the heroic narrative of this historical fiction to an end, with the asterisk that perhaps in the future we can have you back to discuss Merneptah and then Ramesses III and their amazing adventures. If you have time, I'd love to ask you a couple of questions about just life and your own interests in terms of historical fiction and media, and then we can say farewell.
Absolutely.
Great. One question that I try to ask of every scholar who comes on is, what initially brought you to ancient Egypt as a field you wanted to study?
I have a feeling that I have the same answer as a lot of people, that this is something I've been interested in ever since I was very young. Not because there was a particular museum collection or object, although I grew up in St. Louis and there was a small Egyptian collection, but it was really reading books, looking at the hieroglyphs, and really wanting to be able to read them. And what I have found significant about the course of my career is that that initial passion obviously continues to drive me, but at the same time, the more other interests that you have. So, for example, vintage fashion, and then doing increasing amounts of work on fashion in ancient Egypt and the mechanics of ancient Egyptian clothing, as well as interactions with iconography, that specific interests change and you get to add so military history and fashion, military history and its expressions in literature, and obviously an abiding passion for the netherworld books. So yes, definitely goes back to childhood, but it's fun to then see how particular interests and foci of research develops and evolves.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And then one final question, which is another variation on something that I ask of every scholar. If you could go back in time with a time machine and meet one ancient Egyptian person to sit down for a day, have a conversation with, who would you like to meet and why?
Because the obvious Akhenaten and Nefertiti I use a lot. I'm going to go based on our conversation. Djehuty, to hear about his actual exploits, see what he would think about a story being written about him. Maybe there were even kernels of that during his lifetime. But I think to talk with him both about what he did and let him know that he's still very famous, I think would be a lot of fun. And for Reign of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, I would love to have a conversation with Mahu and get his perspective on what it was like being the chief of police during such a tumultuous period in ancient Egyptian history.
It sounds like it might be quite a dark conversation, but certainly an interesting choice. So, Colleen, Dr. Darnell, thank you very much for joining us to discuss historical fiction. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope you'll consider coming back in future to talk about Meneptah, Ramesses III, or the books of the Netherworld, which you published with your husband. So thank you very much for speaking with us.
And thank you so much for having me. This was such a fun conversation, and I very much look forward to being a returning guest.
Excellent.